$47,000. That's all they paid him. $47,000 for 200 acres of land that everyone in Harlan County, Kentucky said was worth less than the gravel on the road running through it. The Whitmore family laughed as they drove away, laughed so hard that Dale Whitmore had to pull over his truck. And why wouldn't they? They just bought out old Harlan Sutton, a 72-year-old widower farming on a cracked ridge that hadn't grown a decent crop in 30 years. Just a dusty old man and a ruined piece of land, or so they thought. Because sitting underneath that ridge, 40 feet below the surface, was a gold-bearing quartz vein running nearly half a mile long, a deposit that 3 separate geological surveys would later estimate to be worth $45 million. But here's what nobody asks. How did Harlan Sutton know? And how did he make sure those Whitmores never got a single ounce of it? If you've ever been underestimated, hit subscribe. These stories are made for people who never quit. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Harlan Sutton had lived on that ridge his entire life. His grandfather had homesteaded the property in 1908, and the land had been in the family ever since. 3 generations, 116 years of Suttons working that soil. Harlan knew every rock on that hill. He knew which hollows flooded in spring and which ones dried up by July. He knew where the deer bedded down and where the foxes denned. He knew the land the way most people know their own names. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Mary Beth, raised 2 kids on that farm, buried her on the property when she passed in 2009. After she died, something in Harlan went quiet. He sold off the cattle, let the fields go fallow, and mostly just walked the land. Neighbors figured grief had turned him slow. Maybe it had. But Harlan was also paying attention to something he'd been noticing for 40 years, something he'd never told a soul. The soil near the eastern ridge was wrong. Not bad, just different. It had a reddish-yellow stain to it in certain light, and after a heavy rain, the creek that ran through the low end of the property sometimes turned a particular shade of milky white. Harlan didn't know exactly what that meant, but he knew enough to know it meant something. The Whitmores had been the biggest landowners in Harlan County for 3 generations. Dale Whitmore ran the family's coal and timber operations, and he had a habit of buying out struggling neighbors at whatever price he thought he could get away with. Most people around there called him fair enough, at least to his face. Behind his back, they called him something else. In the spring of 2019, Dale heard that Harlan Sutton was behind on property taxes. Not far behind, maybe $3,200. But Dale saw an opening. He drove out to the ridge unannounced, found Harlan sitting on the porch, and made his pitch. The land was exhausted, he said. Soil's shot. Creek floods out that bottom field every wet year. I'll do you a favor and take it off your hands. $47,000. Cash. Quick close. No realtor, no fuss. Harlan sat quiet for a long time. Then he nodded and said he'd think about it. 3 weeks later, Harlan signed the papers. County Recorder's Office. Notarized. $47,000 for the whole 200 acres. The transfer included the land, timber rights, water rights, and future development rights. Dale believed he had bought everything worth owning. Dale Whitmore drove home and told his brother Ricky that old Harlan Sutton had just made the dumbest decision of his life. Ricky laughed and poured them both a drink, but Harlan had already made a phone call, 2 months before he ever talked to Dale Whitmore. Go back to 1978. Harlan was 31 years old, working his cattle, when he found something odd near the eastern fence line, a rock outcropping about the size of a car hood, pushed up through the clay by some old geological shift. The rock was white, pure white, with glittery threads running through it, like veins on the back of your hand. He broke off a chunk with a hammer and showed it to his father-in-law, a retired schoolteacher named Gene Hubbard, who had a habit of collecting minerals. Gene turned it over in his hands for a long time, and then said, very carefully, "Harlan, you might want to hold on to this land." That white rock was quartz. And those threads? They had the color and density of sulfide minerals, the same kind that, in certain geological formations, can indicate the presence of gold-bearing ore beneath the surface. Harlan didn't know enough geology to be sure, but he kept the rock, and he started paying attention. Over the decades, he noticed a few more things: old survey stakes near the property line that didn't match any modern county survey, a depression in the hillside that didn't match the natural drainage, almost like something had been dug there long ago and filled back in. And in a box of his grandfather's papers, a hand-drawn map from 1921 with a notation in pencil, promising formation, E. Ridge, C.W. Breck. W. Breck turned out to be one Walter Breckman, a mining assayer who had worked the Kentucky coal fields in the early 1900s. Harlan spent 3 years tracking that name through historical archives at the Harlan County Library, and in 2016, he found it. A field report filed with the Kentucky Geological Survey in 1923, describing a narrow quartz sulfide vein on a ridge property in Harlan County. The report had been misfiled under the wrong township and sat unseen for nearly a century. Harlan made a copy. He put it in a folder, and he waited. 2 months before Harlan signed the sales contract, he had called a retired geologist named Dr. Sandra Pollack, who taught at the University of Kentucky and occasionally did private consulting. He'd found her name in a mining industry newsletter. He mailed her the 1923 Breckman report, the photo of his quartz outcrop, and a soil sample he'd taken from near the eastern ridge. He asked her, plainly, "Is there anything here worth knowing about?" Dr. Pollack wrote back 6 weeks later. She wanted to visit the property. Harlan told her she had 1 week, because he was planning to sell the land and wanted to finalize his decision. What she found on that ridge changed everything. The quartz vein was real, and it was significant. Not the surface outcrop alone, but what the ground-penetrating radar suggested beneath it: a continuous structure running southwest to northeast for at least 2,200 feet, narrowing and widening in the pattern characteristic of a high-grade orogenic gold deposit. Core samples would need to confirm it, but Dr. Pollack told Harlan, standing on that ridge in November 2018, that in her professional opinion, this property warranted serious extraction-level exploration. Harlan thanked her, drove to the county clerk's office the next morning, and pulled copies of his existing deed, specifically documenting which rights were included. Then he called his daughter in Lexington, who was a paralegal, and asked her to recommend a mineral rights attorney. And then he sold the land to Dale Whitmore. Exactly as planned. Why would he do that? Because Harlan Sutton had discovered something even more valuable than gold. The Whitmore family didn't commission a geological survey for almost 14 months. They'd bought the Sutton property as a timber play. The ridge had decent hardwood, and they started clearing in early 2020. That's when one of their equipment operators hit the quartz outcrop with a bulldozer blade, cracked it open, and found himself staring at a seam of mineralized rock that didn't look like anything he'd seen in 20 years of clearing land. Dale Whitmore had a geologist on the property within a week, and within 3 weeks, he had a preliminary assessment that made him sit down very slowly in his office chair and stare at the wall for a long time. He called Harlan Sutton. Harlan answered on the second ring. Dale said he thought there might have been a misunderstanding in the sale. He wanted to revisit the terms. Maybe there was an error in the deed. Maybe Harlan had been unclear on what exactly he was selling. He was willing to be generous. He'd pay Harlan another $200,000 just to make things right. Harlan said he appreciated the call and hung up. Over the next 8 months, the Whitmore family tried 4 different legal strategies to unwind the sale or claim Harlan had committed fraud by concealing known mineral value. Each failed. Their first argument, that Harlan had a duty to disclose the geological potential, was thrown out because Kentucky law places no such obligation on a seller of land unless active misrepresentation occurs. Harlan had said nothing about the geology. He'd simply sold the land. Their second argument was that Harlan had lacked mental capacity at the time of signing. His daughter produced 5 years of tax returns, a letter from his physician, and testimony from his attorney, all demonstrating that Harlan Sutton was sharper than most people half his age. That argument died in a deposition. Their third attempt involved pressuring the county assessor to retroactively reclassify the original sale price as below fair market value, which they claimed constituted some form of irregularity. The assessor, to his credit, declined. The property had been assessed at $44,500 the previous year. The sale price was above assessed value. There was nothing to reclassify. And then Dale Whitmore's lawyers found what they thought was their winning move. In a deed search going back to 1947, Whitmore's legal team claimed they had found an error in the chain of title. A brief period in 1961, when the property's mineral rights had been temporarily severed from the surface deed during a refinancing transaction by Harlan's father. If the severance had never been properly rejoined, the argument went, then the mineral rights might have passed through a different inheritance line entirely. And if that was true, Harlan might never have legally owned the mineral rights, which meant he couldn't have sold them to Whitmore, which meant the mineral rights were potentially in legal limbo and subject to a quiet title action that the Whitmores could initiate. It was a long shot, but it was enough to file a claim, and it was enough to get a hearing scheduled before the Harlan County Circuit Court in March 2021. The Whitmores showed up with 3 attorneys and a stack of documents. Half the county came to watch. Most people expected Harlan to be destroyed. He was an old farmer going up against one of the most powerful families in the region, and the legal argument, however thin, was genuinely complicated. Harlan's mineral rights attorney, a woman named Carol Adkins out of Lexington, stood up and said she had one document she'd like to enter into the record. It was a notarized deed of correction, filed in Harlan County on August 14, 1963, 2 years after the refinancing transaction in question, signed by Harlan's father and witnessed by 2 members of the county recorder's staff, explicitly rejoining the mineral rights to the surface deed and restoring unified title. The document had been filed correctly. It was in the county's own records. The Whitmore legal team had found the 1961 severance issue, but they stopped there. They never followed the chain forward to discover that the problem had already been corrected in 1963. The judge took approximately 4 minutes to dismiss the claim. Harlan Sutton walked out of that courtroom into a cold March afternoon. A few neighbors shook his hand. One old man from the next hollow over clapped him on the shoulder and said, "I always figured that ridge had something in it." Harlan smiled and said he'd had a feeling too. Here's what actually happened to Harlan Sutton. He didn't become a millionaire overnight, and he didn't want to. The gold deposit required full geological confirmation, permitting, environmental review, and eventually a partnership with a licensed mining operation. That process took 3 more years, but the Whitmore family owned the land, and Harlan owned something else. Before selling, Harlan's attorney had insisted on retaining a small 3.5% net smelter royalty on any future mineral extraction from the eastern ridge. It was a routine protective clause that seemed meaningless at the time. Dale Whitmore believed the ridge was worthless and signed without giving it much thought. Years later, that overlooked provision became the most expensive assumption he ever made. At full production estimates, that royalty would pay Harlan Sutton, and after him, his children and grandchildren, somewhere between $80,000 and $130,000 per year for as long as the vein produced ore. Harlan used his first royalty check to pay off the back taxes on a small lot in town he still owned. He donated $15,000 to the Harlan County Public Library, specifically to fund the digitization of their historical mining records, so that no one else would have to spend 3 years tracking down a misfiled survey report. He also funded a small scholarship for county students pursuing degrees in geology or environmental science. He said Mary Beth would have liked that. He still lives modestly, still walks the land, what's left of it around his new house in town. He keeps the original piece of white quartz from 1978 on his kitchen windowsill. The Whitmores still own the ridge. The mining operation is active. Every quarter, they write a check to Harlan Sutton and his heirs. People talk about being patient, like it's the same thing as doing nothing. It isn't. Harlan Sutton spent 40 years paying attention. 20 years quietly gathering evidence, and 2 months making the most important strategic decision of his life, all before Dale Whitmore ever knocked on his door. The Whitmores saw a tired old man and a worthless piece of land. What they couldn't see was that the man had been studying that land since before they were born. Wealth doesn't always announce itself, neither do the people who understand it best. Sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone decided wasn't worth worrying about.